Thank you guys for joining me, and in what we're sort of considering a two-part session. We just heard from some students about their thoughts on, among other things, freedom of speech or free speech, the concept in campus life. So I want to start with the free speech piece because I think there was some really interesting stuff put forward, and get your reactions to it. When asked about racist or homophobic speech and how that is categorized, or is that under protection of free speech? One student said, free speech should be productive speech. And because racist and homophobic speech is not inherently productive, it doesn't qualify as protected speech. Another student said that free speech should clearly not marginalize a certain community. So there seems to be almost like a litmus test in those two conceptions of free speech. And I'd like to get each of your reactions to that. Alicia, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'm interested that in that definition from the students, there's a conception of community. And institutions of higher education are communities. And in order to engage meaningfully and productively in dialogue and conversation about any topic, you have to know the codes of community. You need to be able to count on a strong community in which people can participate fully. And it seems to me that students are expressing the sense that for many different reasons, that they're not included adequately, not supported adequately. And so we talk a lot about speech, but we don't always match speech to practices, to institutional policies, to institutional failures. So we've talked a lot about speech in the current wave of campus protests without talking, I think, fully enough about the ways in which those speech acts, those encounters, are actually tied to institutional failings. It seems to me that we have a lot of work to do to figure out how to set up processes and structures for engagement.
But just to follow up on that, you think inherently the concept of free speech should take into consideration the community?
Well, I think it's not an abstract. To produce free speech, you have to produce the community that can hear it and engage it. And that's our job as institutions of higher education. So I think many of us would say as administrators, our role is to create strong communities where you break down fear and barriers and where you can meaningfully address inequality. Because when you're talking about racism, homophobia, cultural stereotyping, these are, of course, going to be issues of concern in campuses because they are issues in our society, which is so inherently stratified and growing more unequal all the time. So we have a job to figure out what are the ways we gather people and what processes do we have to allow them to engage fully and meaningfully with each other and be able to repair the harms that come up. So we shouldn't be afraid of the negative speech, but we should be accountable to it.
What do you think of that, Ben?
I completely agree, but I would add that as academics, we have multiple layers of what our understanding of speech is. So for instance, we have academic speech.
Sure.
I get paid, so I have to be careful what I say, right? But I also have free speech as a citizen, supposedly, is this unbridled, very capacious kind of speech. So already you have a tension between academic speech, so faculty will respond in very different ways than students. And then on top of that, I think what Alicia is pointing to is that we have a kind of, I'm thinking about Richard Delgado and Mary Matsuda's words that wound and a critical race theory, that speech actually produces injuries. Speech produces subjects, right? So we have a very nuanced understanding that language is more than just whatever you blurt out, but you're actually defining somebody. You're actually responding and hurting people. So how do institutions use this very powerful thing that is speech, which is oftentimes for the general public a very abstract thing? How do we use it to define a community of students? How do we define a set of policies? And then use this to move forward.
Okay, I want to get a little bit more specific because I think, to your point, Alicia, it's fairly abstract concepts that we're talking about. And Ajay, I know with the Trump chalkening at Emory, you You guys sort of had a lot of challenges around the concept of free speech. Talk to me about that situation in the context of what speech should be allowed.
Sure. Let me just build on what my colleagues shared, because I think they're really incredible points and important points for us to consider. At Emory, it's forced us very much to think about what it means to practice community, right? And that's exactly the point that you were making. How do you enact shared values, passions, and commitments as a community? And it doesn't mean that you tell people what to think or how to think, but rather that as a community member, you know, as you enter that community, what the community's values are. And so what I would say in regards to free speech is that we really need to consider in this marketplace of ideas, how does hate speech or speech that ignites a community in a very negative way, how does that fit into the marketplace of ideas? And who is affected by that hate speech? And I would argue, as the students I think were suggesting in the prior session, that they are actually taking on the bulk of the burden there.
In determining what is marginalizing or hurtful.
No, I think when there is hate speech on campus, I think it's on their backs, right? They're the ones most affected by it, and that's what the concerns that they're voicing. And so for me, and at Emory University, I think at all of our institutions, what we're trying to reconcile there is if free speech is paramount, right? If we cherish free speech, and we know that our students are being injured by this speech, what is our responsibility then?
But let me interject, because there are some students who would say, you know, writing pro-Trump messages in chalk is their way of expressing their values and isn't...
Yeah, and actually, in fact, at Emory University, it was really mischaracterized in the media. Our students weren't protesting that you shouldn't write Trump 2016. That's not what they were protesting. They were protesting the political and social climate in the U.S. and on our own campus. And of course, it was a convenient argument to say that these, quote, coddled students were arguing against Trump 2016. That wasn't the case at all. And that's rarely the case on our college campuses. It's really, they're expressing their concern around the narrative that they're actually expressing their concerns about what Trump 2016 means to them. Sure. Not trying to impinge on the rights of our students to write in chalk Trump 2016.
Go ahead.
And just to get also very concrete, it's important to know how long certain communities have had to live in silence to be members of these institutions. That to be queer, to be trans, to be LGBT was to have to live in silence. To be low income in a community of affluent people is to have experienced a certain kind of removal. To be undocumented continues to be. Right? And so one of the things that these students are trying to articulate, which is something that as a society at large, we've left them to figure out far too much, right? Is how to express and articulate the need to defend, to be visible, to be included, and to be able to speak to the heritage of silencing that has gone on.
Sure, that is certainly one form of tradition in America, right? That of marginalization and silencing. But I wonder, especially from some of these storied universities that you come from, how much tradition, quote unquote, is a consideration?
Oh.
And I mean that in the sort of practical iteration of it, whether it's the names of buildings or university rights.
Yeah. So tradition is about looking back. But our institutions are also about moving forward. So rather than looking back, we have to be very attentive to who our students are, what they look like, and what they're saying to us. So initially, if I may bring up the example of when the students wanted names of buildings changes, for instance, my first instinct was, oh God, stop fighting with the ghosts, right? But as I listened more carefully, I began to hear that these students were not fighting with ghosts. They were talking about their present circumstances. So the names of buildings and these kinds of debates, they were insisting of being given an appropriate space like everybody else to explain and to talk about their experiences. So while tradition is very important, it helps a large group of people, but we also have to think about what we're trying to do is move knowledge forward and come up with new traditions, if you like. I mean, that's an oxymoron, but it is about moving knowledge forward. So you have this tension, on the one hand, tradition, but on the other hand is progress.
Sure.
So I want us to not just sort of fall on one side, but also think about the tension of moving forward.
Let me ask you, though, college campuses are different than cities, right? And one of the things a student is supposed to walk away from after 4 years in higher education is the experience of having had a rigorous intellectual debate. And I wonder, and I'll start with you, Ajay, do you think that, as we become more sensitive to, and as we articulate the issues with some of these traditions or otherwise marginalizing systems, do we overcorrect? Is there a marginalization of opposing and perhaps conservative voices that is actually necessary for that robust intellectual development that should be part of campus life?
Well, I absolutely agree with the notion that higher education could do a better job of encouraging debate and dialogue, discovering new ways of knowing and understanding with what we call at Emory the impossible conversation, a conversation no one wants to have. We must have those conversations. But I'm also a firm believer that we simultaneously must prepare students for those conversations, including our marginalized students, and particularly our marginalized students, so that they feel comfortable and safe in engaging in those conversations, because oftentimes they are the ones under attack in those situations. And so this idea of the safe spaces, which have been misunderstood largely, as spaces where you can create knowledge, where you can negotiate conflict, where you can mobilize your community, and then engage in those most difficult conversations, is the work that we should be doing in higher education. And right now we have bits and pieces of that. But I do believe that we should have the debate and dialogue.
Alicia, talk more about that if you could.
So we've just been through a year of extraordinary dialogue and debate, some of it quite contentious, some of it very polarized. But one of the things that I would say from my experience with Yale University was that the institution is working to minoritize students of color and of low-income backgrounds. That in fact, we are a much more diverse, and that students are experiencing difference and articulating difference in ways that really defy the categories that they inherited. And that they're thinking intersectionally, and they're finding ways to talk about class, race, sexuality, and gender in much more complicated and profound ways, and more intelligent ways than the people who teach them, because they've lived more complicated lives. And at Yale, the numbers of these so-called minority students are rising faster. The Latino population is rising faster than any other population. First generation is approaching 20% of the student body. My course, 70% are students who are first generation students, and some of those are international students who are low income. So because Yale has the endowment to pay financial aid. So what they are bringing us is much more than a complaint or a concern of being made marginal. What they are bringing us is a vision of what this potential is. What is the potential that lies in a four-year institution based in residential systems where people from all over the world and from very different kinds of backgrounds live together, study together, do all kinds of activities, and meaningful community engagement is a big part of Yale's life in New Haven. What's the potential there? So a building named Calhoun, it looks like a cosmetic question to say, why would that be the tipping point? Well, in fact, if you look at the history of how the residential college got its name, the building was built in 1930. It wasn't built during the slave era when Calhoun's perspective and vision was normalized. No, it was named in the 30s in a moment of increased xenophobia, racism, and anti-black violence as a gesture of support towards the most ardent segregationist in that history. So students have never sat comfortably with the naming of Calhoun. This is just the first iteration in a number of things. And what we are seeing students say is, shouldn't these institutions reflect the work we do, who we are, and who we are together?
What's interesting to me about all three of you is how much the students are really driving the conversation, right? I mean, and change. And I guess, you know, with the earlier panel, there was talk of the administration, and it's something we talked about backstage. Given the role that students are playing in reshaping, reconfiguring campus life, who is the administration? I mean, who is the man in this scenario, given the power that students have? Ben, when you start?
Well, I think you see three very sympathetic administrators, but also administration can be student affairs, it could be academic affairs, it can be the president and his or her vision, right? So the administration is oftentimes used as a shorthand for an enemy. And you have to understand that many of us are working alongside with students, and I think, Alicia, you pointed this out earlier, which is we are trying to inform students, and they're informing us as how can we provide them a better space for learning. And ultimately, that's what it is, what it's all about. You know, we are, as administrators, it's kind of intellectual work. I never thought about it. I've been in the classroom most of my life, but now as an administrator, I know that it's a different kind of intellectual work. It's about shaping a classroom space, but also community spaces within the university so that students can have conversations. And one of the things that Alicia points out is that we now have a new category of students, first-generation students who actually identified as first generation. In my days, we didn't do this. And what's interesting about the first generation students at Rutgers, they're about a third of our students are first generations, and we're talking about a large public school. They're coming to us with a whole new set of identities and a set of concerns, and we have to be attentive and listen to them so that we can then begin producing those kinds of intellectual spaces, not just in the classroom, but outside.
Okay, and that, I mean, I feel like that's a very progressive, forward-thinking agenda, if you will, as far as managing student life. But Ajay, sometimes you have to say no, right? I mean, at some point, there comes a clash. And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's never, you can't be saying yes to everything because the institution has a set of priorities. What I've tried to push through the students' urging and through their activism is that what would it mean for us at Emory University to prioritize racial justice? That opens up a whole new conversation if you actually prioritize what the students are actually asking for, rather than sort of piecemeal it and just say no, no, no. But rather, racial justice as a priority can be transformative for the institution. It can help you, as you said, reimagine the university. Of course, when you do that, it raises a set of other questions. Right?
And I'm sure within the administration, getting everybody on board with an agenda that's going to address racial justice is not entirely easy, or is it?
It's very difficult, but it's not impossible, because we prioritize things all of the time in higher education. And if the administration, meaning the decision makers with resources, right, prioritize something, it can get done at most institutions. So imagine what it would look like if all of our institutions, or at least the three of our institutions, prioritize race or racial justice, or let's say social justice, and then created an agenda related to that. You know, perhaps we wouldn't see demands every 3-4 years because we're actually being proactive and dismantling sort of the oppressive systems that exist at all of our institutions.
We have time for one question. I'm sorry to rush through this. If you want to raise your hand, someone with a microphone will come around, and I can't see anyone, so maybe, there we go.
Hi, my name's Takeo McCullough. I'm with the National Society of Black Engineers. And my question is regarding the fact that educational institutions within the United States really kind of served as a frontier for segregation for such a long time. Mm-hmm. So now we have this huge influx of this melting pot idea of people of different cultures coming to schools within the United States, whether from abroad or from different diverse backgrounds within the US that are also coming to predominantly white institutions. What role do administrators and professors play in proactively implementing initiatives that encourage cultural equality and cultural conversation, as well as balancing the focus on academics?
Do you want to start?
I was going to say that's
Okay.
our pedagogical imperative, right? That is what we need to do. It is our role to encourage. I mean, I like to think of us as the conscience of a society, right? And be able to generate ideas, but also be seen more as public intellectuals, not just academics in an ivory tower, but really take on that role in leadership in moving knowledge forward for everybody, not just for the select few.
Earlier conversation talked about the defunding of public education. And so the polarization that we're living in society right now in terms of differences in life chances and outcomes is a segregation in itself. So we have not yet shed the structures of segregation in this society. They come in different forms. And students are speaking that experience to us. And they are asking for us to take on the labor that to do the work of repair and to gather students together. And so financial aid is a powerful tool. Developing new curricula is a powerful tool, and it has repercussions far beyond the university. And it's for that reason that as demographics shift in this country, we're going to see more resistance to projects that seek to distribute the goods of education more equally.
We have to leave it there, but thank you to Ajay, Alicia, and Ben for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.